a few pages into chapter 3 in the Yoga of Divine Works. This is titled Self-Surrender in Works, the Way of the Gita, as we saw last time, written originally in early 1915, and then revised substantially by Sri Aurobindo for publication later. So the previous pages in this chapter were a kind of rapid summation of where he was in his approach to the nature of work. And now he begins to touch upon themes from the Gita which are central to this idea that life can be a field of action which leads us from a divided human consciousness into unity with the divine consciousness, and that change in our awareness can substantially transform our lives. So to put the emphasis on life, to place us securely in the field of our daily experience, is part of Sri Aurobindo's aim. We should know that the Gita is a central idea upon which all else turns in the epic Mahabharata. There might have been an epic anterior to the Mahabharata, which we could call the Bharata, which may have had a fewer number of verses. But the Mahabharata, the great story of India, is made to occupy a very large space in the Indian mind. We traditionally say that it was composed, or that the events that it records on Kurukshetra occurred around 3203 BC. We have no way, of course, to substantiate something like that, but we can say from looking at historical analysis and linguistic analysis that this is, at least in parts, a very old text. There are elements of the Mahabharata which could be as old, at least in reference, as the Rig Veda. And that's going back to the beginnings of recorded history in India. The text of the Mahabharata, as we have it now, though, is written in pretty much a classical Sanskrit style. And there is nothing earlier than Panini's works in the field of grammar to refer to the Mahabharata. So we know that it's not as old as the Upanishads or as the Rig Veda. They don't refer to this epic. But Panini does refer to it. And so it's at least 4th century BCE. Not as old as the Upanishads, but still almost 1,000 years earlier than classical texts like the Yoga Sutras. And in the Mahabharata, yoga gets great treatment. In fact, there's an 8-fold path of yoga described in the Mahabharata, apart from what we see in the Bhagavad Gita. Bhishma's utterances about yoga are an important core, CORP, into which we can look to see what the ancient teachings were, again, many centuries before the Yoga Sutras are composed. And we can see that some of the elements that were in practice at the time of the Mahabharata continue up until we get the Yoga Sutras. So Patanjali is drawing upon a very old system. We should also recognize, of course, that if this epic Mahabharata is coming into being in this 4th century and is continuing to be shaped in the centuries afterwards, part of what it has to contend with is a development and evolution of the social mores and structure away from the old Vedic society and towards something different, and also a difference in religious attitude. In the days of the Rig Veda, as far as we know, there was nothing like the traditions of the Shramana, the renunciates who rejected life in the world, in existence yet. There was nothing like that. So it is with the introduction of Jainism and Buddhism, and we know now that Buddha probably lived a century closer to us than we have heretofore thought. So the fact is that much of what we see dealing with ideals of sannyasa, renunciation, in the Mahabharata and indeed in the Gita have correlative value with that they are in a dialogue with the traditions as they emerge of Buddhism and Jainism. If those traditions, in order to achieve freedom from suffering, require a renunciation of the world, the Gita is at pains, as the great text within the Mahabharata, to explain the nature of the universe and the nature of the world and the nature of the divine being, to say that no, it denies that one must leave the world in order to have that experience of freedom, of liberation, of emergence into an eternal reality. So the Gita, as Sri Aurobindo says here in this first sentence that we'll read in a moment, is the greatest doctrine of spiritual works that has ever existed. When we go back and look at the Rig Veda, even there we don't have so summary a statement, so distilled a theory of what is the transcendent, what is the universal, who is the individual moving in the universe representing the transcendent, as the Gita gives us. There may have been experiences, there may have been hints in Vedic society. Surely there was an affirmative approach to life, but it did not have the rounded Vedantic concepts which are available to the philosophers who helped envision and compose the Bhagavad Gita. And the Bhagavad Gita, which occurs, I think, in the 6th book, isn't it, is pivotal to everything else. It is not an accident. It is not created from outside and somehow just wedged anywhere it could fit into the story of the Mahabharata. It is purposely put there and explains all that comes before and the necessity of all that follows. The Gita is the summation of Vedantic teaching, because it doesn't simply reconcile how we move from a world of mutability into a spiritual status in which we reside in the eternal, but how we can synthesize the two states into communion. How is it that we can become aware of the eternal in time? That we can live in the infinite while we occupy a finite body? These are the great problems that the Gita confronts and resolves, or at least hints at what the resolution will be. Because any yoga must actually be lived and not explained. One has to have the liberating experience. One cannot simply read a theory, profess a philosophy, and find that that successfully resolves the complexities of life. If you don't actually place yourself in the experience, if you do not attain the realization, then it is words. So it is actually living these things out that Sri Aurobindo draws our attention to. And how is it that we use these methods to ascend into union, and having attained this state of being yoked to the divine, how do we then express it in all the complexities of life, in all the challenges, in all the conflicts, in the seeming contradictions? How do we stay true to our being, true to that, and live divinely, even as we escape the limitations of morality? So, again, remember the context in which the Gita occurs in that world then, 4th century BCE. What they're confronting with part of the Indian mind beginning to turn away from an active, affirmative approach to life, and how the Gita draws us back to that. And Krishna, in counseling Arjuna, insists upon adhesion to life and to work as a means of ascent, as a means of perfection. So, the greatest gospel of spiritual works ever yet given to the race, the most perfect system of karma yoga known to man in the past, is to be found in the Bhagavad Gita. In that famous episode of the Mahabharata, the great basic lines of karma yoga are laid down for all time with an incomparable mastery and the infallible eye of an assured experience. It is true that the path alone, as the ancients saw it, is worked out fully. The perfect fulfillment, the highest secret, rahasyam uttamam, is hinted rather than developed. It is kept back as an unexpressed part of a supreme mystery. There are obvious reasons for this reticence. For the fulfillment is in any case a matter for experience, and no teaching can express it. It cannot be described in a way that can really be understood by a mind that has not the effulgent transmuting experience. And for the soul that has passed the shining portals and stands in the blaze of the inner light, all mental and verbal description is as poor as it is superfluous, inadequate, and an impertinence. All divine consummations have perforce to be figured by us in the inapt and deceptive terms of a language which was made to fit the normal experience of mental man. So expressed, they can be rightly understood only by those who already know, and knowing, are able to give these poor external terms a changed inner and transfigured sense. As the Vedic rishis insisted in the beginning, the words of the supreme wisdom are expressive only to those who are already of the wise. Rig Veda, Mandala 4, Hymn 3, verse 16. The Gita, at its cryptic close, may seem by its silence to stop short of that solution for which we are seeking. It pauses at the borders of the highest spiritual mind and does not cross them into the splendors of the supramental light. And yet its secret of dynamic and not only static identity with the inner presence, its highest mystery of absolute surrender to the divine guide, Lord, and inhabitant of our nature, is the central secret. This surrender is the indispensable means of the supramental change, and again, it is through the supramental change that the dynamic identity becomes possible. So a secret hinted at, which can be fulfilled only later. The Gita plants a glowing seed that, with consequent evolution of human consciousness, becomes a richer possibility for us. The splendors of the supramental light were not possible 4,000, 5,000 years ago. To develop the mind was the next charge for the evolving human spirit at that stage. And Krishna represents that. As Sri Aurobindo says in his letters and in other places, Krishna would represent the overmind, the Anandamaya, at the level of the overmind consciousness, which is a realm of cosmic awareness, global in its reach, which is that golden lid through which one passes to get to this supramental light. But to aspire to get to that overmental level is all the work of humanity up till now. And that means suffusing our inner being with this liberating light and preparing for a farther evolution that advances into the supramental. Perhaps that possibility is near us now. Mother and Sri Aurobindo worked mightily to set the stage for that culminating change. But to recognize the nature of the divine, as it says here, not only static but also dynamic, a reality that is not simply a fixed, immobile immutability, a sheer white existence, static but also dynamic. It has the capacity to move, to create, and is a constant presence universally. One cannot escape. One is always inside that being. And there's the mystery of it. How is it that we surrender to the presence of this immanent reality, who is the guide, who directs our growth, who uses our ego and our ignorance to push us along so that our soul emerges and flowers, who is constantly inhabiting our nature. At the core of us, behind our best self, is that, expressing that. That's the central secret. And then the capacity to give ourselves to that supreme, so that the dynamic reality of the supramental could manifest. Here we go. This is the secret that the Gita can open us to. What then are the lines of Karma Yoga laid down by the Gita? Its key principle, its spiritual method, can be summed up as the union of two largest and highest states or powers of consciousness, equality and oneness, samatha, ekagrata. The eternal of its method is an unreserved acceptance of the divine in our life as in our inner self and spirit. An inner renunciation of personal desire leads to equality, accomplishes our total surrender to the divine, supports a delivery from dividing ego, which brings us oneness. But this must be a oneness in dynamic force, and not only in static peace or inactive beatitude. The Gita promises us freedom for the spirit, even in the midst of works and the full energies of nature, if we accept subjection of our whole being to that which is higher than the separating and limiting ego. It proposes an integral dynamic activity founded on a still passivity. A largest possible action irrevocably based on an immobile calm is its secret. Free expression out of a supreme inward silence. So, the Gita agrees that our first step is to gain liberation from ego, from desire, from all that constricts us in this small form of self, and gaining eternity. Then we come back into time and fulfill our mission in this limited form. One has to get to that state. That must be the first goal, as Sri Aurobindo will discuss later in the synthesis, I think. We begin with Vedantic liberation, and we end with a tantric synthesis, a tantric extension into life. So he fulfills the demand for spiritual liberation while fulfilling life's demands. This is what the yogi achieves. All things here are the one and indivisible, eternal, transcendent, and cosmic Brahman that is in its seeming divided in things and creatures. Bhagavad Gita, chapter 13, shloka 17. In seeming only, for in truth it is always one and equal in all things and creatures, and the division is only a phenomenon of the surface. As long as we live in the ignorant seeming, we are the ego and are subject to the modes of nature. Enslaved to appearances, bound to the dualities, tossed between good and evil, sin and virtue, grief and joy, pain and pleasure, good fortune and ill fortune, success and failure, we follow helplessly the iron or gilt and iron round of the wheel of Maya. At best, we have only the poor relative freedom, which by us is ignorantly called free will. But that is at bottom illusory, since it is the modes of nature that express themselves through our personal will. It is force of nature, grasping us, ungrasped by us, that determines what we shall will and how we shall will it. Nature, not an independent ego, chooses what object we shall seek, whether by reasoned will or unreflecting impulse at any moment of our existence. And here's the rub. As long as we live in the ego, we are a tool of nature. As long as our consciousness is identified with that, it is nature who drives us. We may think we do, but that's a fiction. That does through us. If, on the contrary, we live in the unifying reality of the Brahman, then we go beyond the ego and overstep nature. For then we get back to our true self and become the spirit. In the spirit, we are above the impulsion of nature, superior to her modes and forces. Attaining to a perfect equality in the soul, mind, and heart, we realize our true self of oneness, one with all beings, one too with that which expresses itself in them and in all that we see and experience. This equality and this oneness are the indispensable twin foundation we must lay down for a divine being, a divine consciousness, a divine action. Not one with all. We are not spiritual, not divine. Not equal-souled to all things, happenings, and creatures. We cannot see spiritually, cannot know divinely, cannot feel divinely towards others. The supreme power, the one eternal and infinite, is equal to all things and to all beings. And because it is equal, it can act with an absolute wisdom according to the truth of its works and its force, and according to the truth of each thing and of each creature, and of every creature. This is also the only true freedom possible to man, a freedom which he cannot have unless he outgrows his mental separativeness and becomes the conscious soul in nature, Purusha. The only free will in the world is the one divine will of which nature is the executrix, for she is the master and creator of all other wills. So only the Purushottama, the Supreme Person, is free. And the Supreme Nature, Paraprakriti, expresses the will of the Purushottama. Human free will can be real in a sense, but like all things that belong to the modes of nature, it is only relatively real. The mind rides on a swirl of natural forces, balances on a poise between several possibilities, inclines to one side or another, settles, and has the sense of choosing. But it does not see. It is not even dimly aware of the force behind that has determined its choice. It cannot see it because that force is something total and to our eyes indeterminate. At most, mind can only distinguish with an approach to clarity and precision some out of the complex variety of particular determinations by which this force works out her incalculable purposes. Partial itself, the mind rides on a part of the machine, unaware of 9/10 of its motor agencies in time and environment, unaware of its past preparation and future drift. But because it rides, it thinks that it is directing the machine. So we're fully immersed in nature, incapable of knowing all but the superficies in which we are in contact, and think that because of that, we understand and master the flow. And we struggle and are constantly disappointed because we cannot control the universe. In a sense, it counts. For that clear inclination of the mind, which we call our will, that firm settling of the inclination which presents itself to us as a deliberate choice, is one of nature's most powerful determinants, but it is never independent and sole. You'll remember in our study of the life divine that Sri Aurobindo described this formative ego as it builds its cognition and gathers its force and applies its will, has a fictional belief that it's in charge of things. But it's important, even though it's a limit, because through that fictional ego and through that limited will, the soul within, the psychic being, builds force, presses into experience, begins to taste and assimilate the universe. And without that, which is part of the necessary enginery of the cosmos, it would not be able to so develop. So it is an indispensable step, as he will say elsewhere. Ego is the helper. Ego is the bar. Behind this petty instrumental action of the human will, there is something vast and powerful and eternal that oversees the trend of the inclination and presses on the turn of the will. There is a total truth in nature greater than our individual choice. And in this total truth, or even beyond and behind it, there is something that determines all results. Its presence and secret knowledge keep up steadily in the process of nature a dynamic, almost automatic perception of the right relations, the varying or persistent necessities, the inevitable steps of the movement. There is a secret divine will, eternal and infinite, omniscient and omnipotent, that expresses itself in the universality and in each particular of all these apparently temporal and finite inconscient or half-conscient things. This is the power or presence meant by the Gita when it speaks of the Lord within the heart of all existences, who turns all creatures as if mounted on a machine by the illusion of nature. This is Bhagavad Gita, chapter 18, Shloka 61. This divine will is not an alien power or presence. It is intimate to us, and we ourselves are part of it, for it is our own highest self that possesses and supports it. Only it is not our conscious mental will. It rejects often enough what our conscious will accepts, and accepts what our conscious will rejects. For while this secret one knows all and every whole and each detail, our surface mind knows only a little part of things. Our will is conscious in the mind, and what it knows by the thought only. The divine will is superconscious to us because it is, in its essence, supramental. And it knows all because it is all. Our highest self, which possesses and supports this universal power, is not our ego self, not our personal nature. It is something transcendent and universal, of which these smaller things are only foam and flowing surface. Reminds one of that line from Savitri: heaven's wiser love rejects the mortal's prayer. Our ego struggles for a goal, but that in us which is divine is cognate with the Supreme Will, who says, not a good idea. If we surrender our conscious will and allow it to be made one with the will of the eternal, then, and then only, shall we attain to a true freedom, living in the divine liberty We shall no longer cling to this shackled so-called free will, a puppet freedom, ignorant, illusory, relative, bound to the error of its own inadequate vital motives and mental figures. So yes, we wrest our consciousness free from identification with this limited frame, this particular instrument, the ego, all of its preferred thoughts and feelings, etc., so that we can experience the divine who is in us and the same that is all around, oneness and equality. When we arrive at that, then we can return to the fulfillment of nature. So I think we can read a section from Savitri now. This again is in the Book of Beginnings, Book 1, the Book of Beginnings. It's a great book. And we're all beginning. This is Canto 5. The Yoga of the Spirit's Freedom and Greatness, on page 88. A giant order was discovered here, of which the tassel and extended fringe are the scant stuff of our material lives. This overt universe, whose figures hide the secrets merged in superconscient light, wrote clear the letters of its glowing code. A map of subtle signs surpassing thought was hung upon a wall of inmost mind, illumining the world's concrete images into significant symbols by its gloss. It offered to the intuitive exegete its reflex of the eternal mystery. Ascending and descending twixt life's poles, the serried kingdoms of the graded law plunged from the everlasting into time, then glad of a glory of multitudinous mind, and rich with life's adventure and delight, and packed with the beauty of matter's shapes and hues, climbed back from time into undying self, up a golden ladder carrying the soul, tying with diamond threads the spirit's extremes. In this drop from consciousness to consciousness, each leaned on the occult in conscience power, the fountain of its needed ignorance, arch-mason of the limits by which it lives. In this soar from consciousness to consciousness, each lifted tops to that from which it came, origin of all that it had ever been, and home of all that it could still become. An organ scale of the Eternal's acts, mounting to their climax in an endless calm, paces of the many-visaged wonderful, predestined stadia of the evolving way, measures of the stature of the growing soul, they interpreted existence to itself, and mediating twixt the heights and deeps, united the veiled married opposites, and linked creation to the ineffable. A last high world was seen, where all worlds meet. In its summit gleam, where night is not nor sleep, the light began of the Trinity Supreme. All there discovered what it seeks for here. It freed the finite into boundlessness and rose into its own eternities. The inconscient found its heart of consciousness, the idea and feeling groping in ignorance, at last clutched passionately the body of truth. The music born in matter's silences plucked nude out of the ineffable's fathomlessness the meaning it had held but could not voice. The perfect rhythm, now only sometimes dreamed, an answer brought to the torn earth's hungry need, rending the night that had concealed the unknown, giving to her her lost, forgotten soul. A grand solution closed the long impasse in which the heights of mortal effort end. A reconciling wisdom looked on life. It took the striving undertones of mind, and took the confused refrain of human hopes, and made of them a sweet and happy call. It lifted from an underground of pain the inarticulate murmur of our lives, and found for it a sense illimitable, a mighty oneness its perpetual theme. It caught the soul's faint, scattered utterances, read hardly twixt our lines of rigid thought, or mid this drowse and coma on matter's breast, heard like disjointed mutterings in sleep. It grouped the golden links that they had lost, and showed to them their divine unity, saving from the error of divided self the deep spiritual cry in all that is. Namaste. Jai Ma.